Hello, class. Welcome to the course, Epistle to the Galatians. We'll get started with the introductory material, the introductory background for this letter that Paul wrote to the Galatian churches. So let's get started. Jerome, one of the church fathers, once said that when he read the letters of the Apostle Paul, he could hear thunder. Nowhere is Paul more disappointed and disturbed than in the Epistle to the Galatians. Galatians is different from Paul's other letters. From beginning to end, its 6 chapters of 149 verses bristle with passion, sarcasm, and anger. True, there's a touch of tenderness as well. Once in the midst of the letter, in chapter 4, verse 19, Paul referred to the Galatians as his dear children. As the context reveals, Paul must endure the pain of seeing the churches he founded in danger of committing spiritual suicide. He was astonished and perplexed by their departure from the truth of the gospel. He feared they had been bewitched and deceived. Who was the author? Few facts related to the history and interpretation of this epistle to the Galatians have virtual unanimity among all scholars everywhere. But here's one. Galatians was indeed written by Paul the Apostle, as its opening verse attests. In the 19th century, F.C. Baur and those of the Tübingen school pushed many New Testament writings, including most of Paul's letters, into the mid-2nd century, thereby calling into question their genuine apostolicity and historical trustworthiness. This radical criticism of F.C. Baur and his school was based on a hypothetical reconstruction of early church history that denied the apostolic age, the kind of highly developed Christology found in Colossians and the pastoral epistles. Yet, for all this, even Baur himself recognized the genuineness and integrity of Galatians. He included it, along with Romans and the 2 letters to the Corinthians, among the 4 great epistles of the Apostle Paul, which takes precedence over the rest of them in every respect. So, who was it sent to? Given what we know about the history of Asia Minor in this period, there seems to be 3 possible ways of interpreting the phrase the churches of Galatia, to the churches of Galatia. First, let's look at the pan-Galatian theory. Theoretically, the phrase could include various groups of Christians scattered throughout the enlarged Roman province of Galatia. However, this hypothesis has been generally discounted because there are several difficulties with it. Galatians addresses specific issues and controversies arising at a particular place and time in Paul's missionary activities. He wrote about a matter of great urgency to people he knew very well. He also wrote with a kind of specificity that would make it almost inconceivable for him to address the letter to different congregations scattered over so large a geographical area. Another theory, a second one, is the North Galatian theory. Until the late 19th century, it was almost universally held that the Galatians to whom Paul wrote to were the descendants of the ancient Celtic peoples who settled in north-central Asia Minor. This view was taken for granted by the church fathers, who commented on Paul's letter to the Galatians several centuries after he had written it. By the 4th and 5th centuries, the Christian faith was thriving in this part of northern Asia Minor. In the 16th century, Martin Luther, John Calvin, and the other reformers accepted the North Galatian tradition. On balance, however, the weight of evidence falls strongly in support of the view that Paul addressed his letter to the congregations in South Galatia that he and Barnabas established on their very first missionary journey. So let's look at that theory, the third one, the South Galatian theory. When we compare the content of Galatians with Luke's account of Paul's evangelization of the South Galatian cities, we find a number of striking parallels that point toward the identification of the churches of Galatia with these Christian congregations. The theme of justification by faith constitutes a major theme in the Galatian letter and was at the heart of the missionary strategy Paul and Barnabas pursued in the cities of South Galatia. It is clear that Galatians was written to a congregation composed primarily of Gentile believers. We know that the initial preaching of the gospel among the churches of Galatia was accompanied by miraculous signs and wonders. At one point in his letter to the Galatians, Paul reminded them of how they had initially welcomed him as if I were an angel of God, as if I were Christ Jesus himself. At several points in the Galatian letter, Paul referred to the persecution he had suffered as a preacher of the gospel. So what was the occasion then? If it was written to those churches in South Galatia, then what was the occasion for writing it and when? Paul and Barnabas, after their first missionary journey, returned to Syrian Antioch by the same route they had come. Soon after their departure, the new churches of South Galatia were thrown into great confusion by the arrival of another team of missionaries who contradicted much of what Paul and Barnabas had proclaimed concerning the way of salvation. So great was the disturbance that Paul and Barnabas were sent to Jerusalem to discuss the whole matter with Peter and the other apostles there. In the meantime, Paul had received word that these false teachers had spread this perverted gospel among the newly planted churches. Unable to visit, Paul wrote the letter to the Galatians as a way of restoring order and reestablishing doctrinal integrity among them, the one that he preached to them originally. Thus, it is likely that Galatians was written from Antioch on the eve of the Council of Jerusalem, which usually is dated around AD 49 to 50. So the purpose in writing would be to defend his apostolic authority to those churches. Paul wanted to defend the doctrine of justification by faith alone. Just faith. And to defend the doctrine of Christian liberty, Christian freedom. So let's look at the problem that he was addressing. Too many believers in those South Galatian churches, they think they need to add to their salvation. By grace, through faith alone, does not seem to satisfy them. People added the keeping of some of the laws of Moses to their salvation. Again, the false teachers that came in influenced that. Others believe baptism plays a role in it. Again, others throw what is commonly known as lordship salvation into the mix in today's world. With the Messianic movement, elements like keeping Torah, adhering to Jewish customs, and observing biblical and traditional feasts tend to make favorite additions to salvation. So, salvation is by faith alone in Jesus Christ. And it's faith plus nothing. That's the problem. They were teaching faith plus something else. Faith wasn't enough. So look at the modern Messianic movement now, in our day. The modern Messianic movement is essentially a revival of the one that was present in the land of Israel up to the end of the 4th century. The revival of this movement adheres to the fact that Jesus is the Messiah of Israel At the same time, it also affirms the right of Messianic Jews to identify as Jews. Because of inconsistencies in teaching, various branches have sprung up. One of them is the Ephraimite or two-house movement. Followers of this theology falsely claim Gentiles who believe are members of the lost tribes of Israel and therefore obligated to keep the Torah. See, that would be not faith alone. Actually, this is nothing more than a repetition of the old Galatian heresy in which Jews who claimed to believe in Jesus were telling Gentiles they had to submit to the Mosaic law first. And that concludes the introductory background. Before we study, we need to know the introductory background of this epistle. And so here's the sources for the material here. The New American Commentary on Galatians by Timothy George, and also the work by Dr. Arnold Fruchtenbaum called Faith Alone, the Condition of Our Salvation, an exposition of the book of Galatians. And so that concludes our introductory lecture.